Depression. We're trying to figure out how to spend $500 billion quickly in a way that stimulates the economy as much as possible, and we're trying to do it with a minimum of waste, fraud, and abuse. All that is important, but there's a resolution on the floor honoring my alma mater for winning the National Men's Basketball Championship. I hope you understand the priority there. I do welcome everyone to the committee's second hearing on oversight related to the American Recovery and Reconstruction Act. These hearings are titled Follow the Money, after the character in the movie and in the book, All the President's Men, the Deep Throat character who told Bernstein and Woodward to trace the money back to find out where the corruption began. Now we're at the front end trying to figure out where the money's going to go. And we hope we will not end up with anything as sordid as that was, but perhaps by starting this effort and knowing at the outset the care that must be taken, we can avoid it. Our hearing in March featured inspectors general describing their efforts to establish the oversight mechanisms called for in the Act. And now we'll hear from Mr. Devaney, chairman of the new Recovery, Accountability, and Transparency Board. He has before him the daunting task of sitting at the top of the Recovery Act oversight pyramid. He has to marshal the capabilities of the inspectors general devoted to the Recovery Act oversight, coordinate their deployment across multiple agencies, cooperate with opposite numbers in cities and states, share all the lessons learned, and run a data management operation trying to turn a massive amount of information into answers to the questions we all have. Are we improving the economy? How many people have we put to work, or how many jobs have we saved? He was not able to testify in March at our first hearing, but he said that he would appear as soon as possible, and he's proven good to that word. We welcome him today. We also welcome General Gene Dodaro, head of the Government Accountability Office, GAO. His job description is very similar to Mr. Devaney's, except that his jurisdiction covers all of federal government. Mr. Dodaro will bring us up to date on the progress our science agencies have made in using their Recovery Act appropriations. GAO has also issued the first of its reports examining state and local use of Recovery Act funds. It mentions the loss of funding and staff at state and local oversight organizations at the same time that we are asking for the state and local governments to play a significant role in monitoring Recovery Act projects. That should concern us, as it will directly affect our ability to build a system that can follow a Recovery Act dollar as it leaves our Treasury and then goes, to use one example, to the Department of Transportation, from there to the Department of Transportation in North Carolina, and eventually becomes asphalt paving a part of the Raleigh Beltline, Interstate 440. It seems like a simple task, but Dr. Bass and Mr. Gillespie before explained that there remain a number of issues, and Mr. Devaney will have to deal with those issues. Dr. Ellig will also raise some questions about the methods of reporting performance as Recovery Act initiatives advance. Traditionally, oversight has been an after-the-fact focus when someone has done wrong, and by the time we get here, the money's already gone, and there's nothing much we can do about it except scold the people who were responsible, perhaps providing a deterrent for others to make the same mistakes. But with the Recovery Act, we are trying to set out a new approach, giving the people, all the American people, the opportunity to look at the raw data, or as raw as possible, and bring to bear their own experience, and some knowledge from places we may not have expected to help us spot the danger ahead. We are, in essence, deputizing the entire American citizenry to help with the oversight of this program. A whole industry has grown up around the release of National Weather Service data, benefiting other important sectors of the economy like agriculture and utilities. That model works because the Weather Service takes seriously its responsibility to provide high-quality data, check for accuracy and integrity. And we need Recovery Act data to do the same thing. Very often, discovery of the misuse of public resources cannot happen without the willingness of someone to step forward, to say something's wrong, to blow the whistle. That can be a life-altering decision for those who do blow the whistle. And there is pressure to avoid damaging the organization of which they are part, sometimes intense pressure. The Recovery Act adds to the protections that whistleblowers get outside of the federal government because those folks will be perfectly positioned to tell us if something is going wrong. We have to make sure that potential whistleblowers know that those protections will be effective and that they are safe to do their duty to step forward and tell us if something's wrong. Ms. Bryan has long experience with those issues and will help us with that. I have a special welcome for one of our witnesses today, Dr. Clarence Newsom, the president of Shaw University in Raleigh. Dr. Newsom has told me for some time of his concern that for smaller institutions like his, for them, it is not easy to find out about opportunities in the Recovery Act. And I've heard the same thing from elected officials in small towns in my district telling me the same thing, trying to figure out a way to get access to some of the funds for worthy projects in their own communities. Funds in the Recovery Act are supposed to be distributed based upon competition so that all the best ideas should be in the running, but as we try to speed those funds into the economy, I think we're all concerned that there is a fair chance that, that less competitive projects don't win out by default because they have access to better information. Every August, Washington goes into a slumber known as the August recess. Dr. Brown and Ms. Dowkemper and I will not sleep through August. We will be home in our districts talking to people there. It's our chance to find out how Congress is doing, how we are doing, and with these hearings, we want to make sure that we can answer questions about the Recovery Act. Again, we're trying to spend $500 billion or so. The total amount of recovery is closer to $800 billion, but about more than 60% of it is spending as opposed to tax cuts, and we're trying to spend it quickly and at the same time spend it efficiently without waste or abuse, which is no small task. And with that, I now recognize Dr. Brown, the ranking Republican on the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me welcome my witnesses here today. I think I shook hands with the two in the first panel. I apologize for not having shook hands with the other witnesses, but welcome. We're glad to have you. This is the second hearing that this committee has held on this very important topic, the Stimulus Act oversight. While it's no secret that my colleagues on this side of the dais and I voted against the stimulus bill, this committee does have an obligation to make sure that if taxpayers' money is going to be spent, that it be done appropriately. As I said at the previous hearing, identifying waste, fraud, and abuse is a nonpartisan endeavor. In addition to providing oversight of stimulus funding, it is also important for Congress to accurately assess the effectiveness of the Act by using metrics to track success and evaluate outcomes. Without this, Congress is simply spending money based on evaluations just as random as how it determined the ultimate funding level for the Act. Like the TARP bailout, funding levels seem to have been chosen arbitrarily, as if drawn from a hat. Presumably, the anticipated results were as well. The President advertised 3.5 million jobs as a result of this Act, yet I'm not sure how many folks will be able to explain where that number came from or how it will be ultimately verified. Perhaps it came from the same hat the funding level was pulled from. The National Bureau of Economic Research, the group of economists tasked with determining the start and end of economic downturns, announced that December 2007 was the start of the current recession. Their research also indicated that economic downturns have usually lasted between 6 and 16 months since the Great Depression. Take into consideration that most of the stimulus spending won't occur until after 2010, and that the CBO determined that the stimulus bill will actually decrease gross domestic product in the out years by crowding out private investment. And one has to wonder what we're doing for this, what we're doing this for. Our children and grandchildren who ultimately are going to pay for this deserve an answer. The stimulus bill put taxpayers on the line for $3.27 trillion when you add debt servicing and the account for program extensions. Under the Obama budget, the national debt will double in 5 years and triple in 10. That's outrageous. Add to that the revelation that the federal government has already run out of money halfway through this fiscal year, and we have a recipe for disaster. Whether or not you agree with the underlying act, we still have to make sure that the government is capable of spending this money appropriately with as little waste, fraud, and abuse as is possible, and in a manner that directly benefits our country. In order to determine if the act does indeed benefit the nation, we need to clearly define metrics for this success. Simply put, the American people need to know what they got for their money. Since the stimulus bill was sold as a means to jumpstart our economy and create jobs, it is important to identify baselines, track progress, and evaluate whether those outcomes were the result of a stimulus act or by other means. On today's second panel, we'll hear from outside groups who can contribute greatly to ensuring that the funds are spent appropriately in a transparent and accountable manner. With agencies, Inspector Generals, OMB, GAO, and the RAT Board, and Congress overwhelmed by the size of the spending, everyday citizens and outside groups will prove to be critical in ferreting out waste, fraud, and abuse. They can also help evaluate not only the effectiveness of the spending, but also whether the administration has followed through on its ambitious promise of transparency and accountability. In addition to the witnesses appearing before us, I would also like to include in the written record a letter from the Americans for Tax Reform. Their letter clearly highlights the fallacy of government wealth creation, concerns with employment metrics, and also some of the challenges associated with transparency and accountability. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to the witnesses' testimony and yield back the rest of my time.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. If you could attach that letter to your testimony, it can be part of the record.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
And without objection, we will take opening statements submitted by other members to include in the record. It is so ordered. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first panel of witnesses, although I've largely introduced them already in my opening statement. Mr. Earl Devaney is the chairman of the Recovery, Accountability, and Transparency Board established by H.R. 1 and is formerly the Inspector General of the Department of the Interior. Mr. Gene Dodaro is the Acting Comptroller General of the United States Government Accountability Office, the GAO. As our witnesses should know, you have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When you have completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with questions, and we will alternate with each member having 5 minutes to question the panel. It's the practice of this committee or the subcommittee to receive testimony under oath. Do either of you have any objection to taking an oath? The record can reflect that neither did. You also have the right to be represented by counsel. Do either of you have counsel here? And the witnesses both responded, no. We ask you these questions to put you at ease for your testimony. If you would now please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth? The record should reflect that both witnesses did take the oath. We will now start with Mr. Devaney. Mr. Devaney, you may begin.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Braun, and members of the subcommittee, I want to thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the efforts and progress of the Recovery Board. My testimony today will address the current status and mission of the Board, and after I make my opening remarks, I'll be glad to answer any questions. Mr. Chairman, the members of the Board and I view the Board as having a dual mission. First, the Board is responsible for establishing and maintaining a website. the purpose of which is not only to foster historic levels of transparency of recovery funds, but to do so in a user-friendly way. Second, the Board will coordinate and conduct oversight of recovery funds to help minimize fraud, waste, or mismanagement. I'm pleased to tell you that the Board continues to advance its mission of accountability and has recently taken several important steps to achieve its goal of an unprecedented level of transparency for recovery funds. With respect to the accountability mission, the Board has formed a Recovery Funds Working Group. Unlike the Board, which is by law composed of 10 specific IGs and a chairperson, the working group was created to foster participation and input from all 28 IGs that oversee agencies receiving recovery funds. The working group is co-chaired by the Department of Transportation's IG and a former IG who's on the Board's staff. The working group has already identified a number of projects, such as creating a recovery audit work plan, suggesting ways to improve the single audit process, and identifying high-risk programs in the agencies. Beyond the federal government IG community, the Board is interacting with many others involved in the oversight of recovery funds. As part of its initial outreach, the Board's procurement compliance staff is meeting with senior procurement executives from each agency receiving funds. The Board staff has also developed a procurement checklist to assist federal agencies charged with spending recovery funds. It is our hope that this type of agency outreach can help prevent fraud, waste, and mismanagement of recovery funds before it happens. The Board is also reaching out to assist states with their new Recovery Act responsibilities. This week, for example, I'm hosting a visit from the new Recovery IG of California, a state that will be receiving more than $45 billion in Recovery Act funds. I will be introducing her to the IGs who are overseeing monies headed for California, the Board staff, and the recovery teams at OMB and GAO. I hope to host similar meetings with oversight officials from other states and cities in the future. Last week I spoke, as I have several times before, at a meeting of high-level state officials who convened in Washington to discuss recovery fund implementation issues. In addition, on May 20th, I'll be speaking to a gathering of state IGs in Orlando. On each of these occasions, I deliver the message that the Board is here to assist them with their oversight, and they should feel free to tell us about any help that they may need. In order to better focus and utilize its resources, the Board has formed two committees, one dedicated to the Board's accountability mandate and the other to the Board's continuing development of recovery.gov. Each committee is currently composed of 3 board members. These committees meet in addition to the regular board meetings and then report back to the entire Board on the status of these critical initiatives, as well as giving recommendations for moving forward. The Board's Accountability Committee, for instance, will discuss strategies for not only receiving reports of fraud, waste, and mismanagement and referring them to the appropriate IG, but also analyzing and developing reports in light of available open source data. These reports will make the Board's referrals more value-added for the IGs and will also contribute to risk-based predictions about potential fraud. On the IT side, the Board's Recovery.gov committee is working to provide strategic direction on an entire range of IT efforts that are before the Board. Mr. Chairman, it's important to remember that the creation of the website is an evolving process with multiple phases. It's not a single event. Now that the first phase of getting recovery.gov is up and running has ended, we are moving quickly to implement the second phase of development. The Board is beginning to manage the website's design and content. OMB will still retain responsibility for the reporting guidance and the verification of the data. And GSA will continue to host the website and will work with the Board to collect and store the data. I'm confident that this division of labor will provide the best opportunity to maximize recovery.gov's use as a transparency and accountability tool, and I'm equally confident that we will have the opportunity to achieve unparalleled citizen participation. On the subject of citizen participation, we also hope to employ the creative and innovative ideas the public may have for the future of recovery.gov. The Board just this past week hosted an electric town hall with NAPA and OMB designed to engage the public, recipients, and IT professionals, and our local, state, and local and tribal partners. While my impression was that we would get a high level of participation, the overwhelming response to our electric town hall surpassed even my wildest expectations. At the end of this event, the site had received well over 4.2 million hits. Over 1,800 citizens had taken the time to register online, and we feel we have close to 550 solid ideas. NAPA is now in the process of assembling and analyzing these ideas, which will then allow us to move quickly to a competitive process for vendor selections. Mr. Chairman, I think I've run out of time, so why don't I just stop there, because I think the questions are going to be more informative.
Thank you, Mr. Devaney. You were just barely over time. Mr. Dodaro, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to be here with you and Ranking Member Brown and Congresswoman Dal Kemper. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to discuss how GAO has been working with the broader accountability community to carry out our responsibilities under the Recovery Act. The Act assigns GAO a range of responsibilities to include bi-monthly reviews of the uses of the recovery funds by selected states and localities. Now, given the intergovernmental nature of this task, it's been a priority from the beginning to make sure that we're coordinating properly with the broader accountability community. Soon after the Act was passed, I outreached to the Inspector General community, and within a couple of weeks of the Act's passage, we met with 17 Inspectors General or their representatives. I also outreached to the state community. We had a conference call with over 46 state audit offices and dozens of local audit offices across the country. We're coordinating, of course, with Mr. Devaney's board functions as well. Now, this coordination activity really served us well as we took our teams to the field. In order to fulfill the responsibilities bi-monthly reviews, we selected 16 states and the District of Columbia to do a longitudinal study over the next 2 or 3 years of the uses of the funds, recovery funds, by those jurisdictions and what impact that those funds would have in those localities. These 16 states and the District of Columbia are expected to receive over 2/3 of the amount of Recovery Act funds flowing to states and localities. Now, during fiscal year 2009, there's estimated outlays of $49 billion that are expected to go to the states and localities. And in the question and answer period, I can talk about the projected outlay rate over the next few years if you'd like, and how the composition of the funding will be changing from 2009 to 2012 to the states and localities. But for fiscal year 2009, over 90% of the $49 billion to be distributed to the states and localities is going to be in the health area, education area, and transportation area. Now, the 3 largest programs there are the Medicaid program, which is the federal matching share, in the highways area for the transportation area, and the state stabilization fund in the education area. So we focus largely on those 3 programs in our first bi-monthly review, and our report was issued last month. Now, basically, in terms of the uses of the funds, most of the funds were drawn down in the Medicaid area. The 16 states in the district had an allocation of about $16.9 billion. They had collectively drawn down $7.9 billion, or about 47% of their allocation. In the highways area, about $15.5 billion had been allocated to the 17 jurisdictions. About $3.3 billion had been obligated, and by obligated, that means the Federal Department of Transportation and the State Department of Transportation had agreed on projects. So there were about 950 projects, but most of them were in the competitive bid stage during the April and May timeframe and were not yet awarded, so that there was not a significant amount of Recovery Act funds yet distributed in the transportation area. In the state stabilization fund area, about over $20 billion was allocated to these states, but before they can spend the money, they have to submit an application to the Department of Education, who reviews it and then gives them the ability to spend the money. Of the 16 states, at the time our report was issued, only 2 states, California and Illinois, had received approval from the departments. Now, we made a series of recommendations to strengthen the accountability features at the state level. A big concern was that the states were under fiscal constraints, and they had cut back some of their accountability and oversight mechanisms, both in the management area and audit area. And we suggested that OMB clarify whether or not Recovery Act funds can be used to strengthen the state and local accountability mechanisms. And this is very important. And also, we made a recommendation to more effectively use the single audit process, which is a standard accountability tool, to make sure that it can be more effective in providing adequate oversight over the Recovery Act funds. Earlier in 2009, before the vast majority of funds are spent in 2010, 2011. We also suggested OMB provide greater guidance on methodologies to be used to report the number of jobs created and the number of jobs preserved. Now, with regard to the R&D funding in the agencies that we reported to you on within this committee's jurisdiction in March, of the almost $22 billion in R&D funding as of last week, basically $342 million of that had been obligated, largely in the Department of Energy and the Office of Science, for funding some renovations at the national laboratories. And so, but I'd be happy in the question and answer session to talk more about our recommendations in this area and any other questions that you would like to pose to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. By the standards the committee has set and other witnesses have set, you both were very close to your time limits, and I think it's probably a good thing that men in your position are rule followers. I look forward to seeing if the benefit of your example affects any member of the committee. I do now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning, and each member here will have a turn. Mr. Devaney, the President Obama promised a level of transparency through the internet, recovery.gov. The public was led to believe that that would be available, that would get right down to who got the contract for pouring asphalt. But it's been experienced this subcommittee in the last 2 years, that particularly with respect to IT projects, trying to assemble information in different forms from different agencies and put it all in one usable format, although that seems like that ought to be something readily accomplished. We find out that years later and millions of dollars later, what appeared to be a very qualified bidder got the contract, and what they produced is worse than what they started with. How do you intend to provide that level of transparency to see who actually got the contract to pour asphalt?
Mr. Chairman, obviously it'll probably be done through the recovery.gov website.
Right.
And as I mentioned in my testimony, that website is evolving and developing. And I will be the first to admit today that website doesn't give you that kind of information. The information, quite frankly, isn't there yet. It hasn't come back in yet. But it will have to be, the website will have to be ready to receive the data that comes pouring back into the government in October is the big date. So we have a challenge here. We have about 140 days to move very quickly from this electric town hall, which I described, where we've got all these great ideas, to, in the next week or two, moving into some sort of a competitive process and get the vendors working. It's an enormous challenge. The integration issues are profound, but I'm optimistic by nature, a little bit of mixed in with a little bit of realism, but optimistic, and I think it can be done. And my hope and our goal on the board is that come October or shortly thereafter, the American public will begin to see the data that they so desperately want to see. And we will ensure that that site gets better and better and better as time goes on. But we're not going to stop in October, obviously.
Okay. Mr. Devaney, are you going to build an IT team within your agency, or are you going to rely upon private contractors? How do you plan to proceed?
Well, we've already assembled a team, a good solid IT team. I think I've got the best and brightest in government. We've sort of stolen them, if you will, from other agencies, borrowed them, and in some cases put a lot of leverage on agencies to provide us with the very best people they have, combined with some contractor help we have and the vendors that will be involved in the building of this infrastructure. I think we can get it done.
Okay. Mr. Dodaro, you're facing much the same challenge, are certainly familiar with trying to bring in diverse data, inconsistent data, agencies that use different formats, collect different data, et cetera, et cetera. What are your observations or thoughts on the task of creating from all that diverse data an integrated from two dozen agencies, creating that in a format that will be usable in a single format, understandable?
Yeah. First of all, I want to say I think that the goals that are set out by the legislation and by the implementing guidelines are very laudable goals, and I think set a standard for transparency and accountability in federal spending that haven't been set before. That being said, there will be definitely implementation challenges associated with making sure the data is complete, it's accurate, it's timely, and it's in an understandable format. And so those things can be achieved with a lot of effort, but it will be a challenge and a stretch goal, if you will, for the agencies in order to be able to achieve that. One of my earlier responsibilities was to help orchestrate the first ever financial audit of the federal government's financial statements. And believe it or not, prior to 1997, there was never a financial audit done of any federal department and agency, let alone the consolidated statements of the U.S. government. And that was a monumental achievement, but it took time and effort. It can be done, and I think the commitment's there, but we'll have to wait to see how implementation unfolds.
Following the example set by the witnesses, my time has expired. Dr. Brown is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for both of you gentlemen. Current OMB guidance only requires that money be tracked 2 layers down. For example, a state and city would have to report data, but not the contractor or subcontractor. Do you intend to require additional reporting beyond the OMB guidance, and do you believe 2 layers of accountability are enough to satisfy the President's promise that, quote, every American will be able to go online and see where and how we're spending every dime, unquote?
I'll answer that by saying that if I could make a wave a magic wand, I would want to follow a dollar from cradle to grave. As I said earlier, the division of labor here, and as it should be, is that OMB is responsible for providing the guidance as to what needs to be reported. They're also going to be responsible for scrubbing the data, which is, my fellow witness mentioned, is going to be an enormous challenge to make sure that that data is accurate. So I think that we're going to have a situation where we're going to wait probably for OMB to come out with some additional guidance in the future after a few quarters have gone by and we see where the missing gaps are. And I'm going to push them very hard to give me as much data as possible.
Do you intend to carry it all the way down to the ultimate consumer?
I'd like
as the chairman was talking to.
I'd like to do that.
So 2 layers is not enough.
I'd like to get it down to where we can see where it went at the end of the day. That's from an accountability standpoint.
Mr.
Yeah.
Dodaro.
Yeah, I agree completely with what Mr. Devaney has just said. You know, my understanding is that based upon input that have been received by GAO, state and local officials and others, that OMB is reevaluating the guidance that they have. I know this issue came up when I testified on this subject before the Senate, and the expectation is and the hope is that more complete reporting will be included in the next set of expanded guidance. I mean, it definitely needs to be on the manager's screen to make sure there's adequate accountability, and if you have that, and the real challenge will be make sure it's in a cost-effective type of reporting approach, but you need more complete reporting.
Well, I agree with both of you, and I think this promise that the President's made is unfillable, and I don't think it's going to be, unfortunately. Mr. Devaney, the Americans for Tax Reform point out an interesting contradiction in their letter. President Obama recently claimed in his press conference marking his 100th day in office on April 29th that the Stimulus Act has already saved 150,000 jobs. Don't know where you got that figure. maybe pulled out of the hat, like a lot of these figures are. They also point out that the Bureau of Labor Statistics show 1.3 million jobs lost since the president took office. Given that you're tasked with providing accountability with independence, how do you plan to verify the actual number of jobs created?
Well, sir, we haven't really received any information about that on the website, to the Recovery Board. It hasn't come in to us. I'm assuming that those figures come from the Council of Economic Advisors, which has been working in the jobs area, and forthcoming information, hopefully soon, will be coming forward about how to count jobs. So we don't have it yet. I eagerly await it, and as soon as I get it, we'll put it up.
Well, I appreciate that, and I hope that you will verify the numbers. I think very probably these numbers are just picked out of the clear blue sky and are not authenticated or authenticatable at this point. But anyway, let me carry on. In her testimony, Ms. Bryan describes Congress' decision not to provide meaningful protections for federal whistleblowers with respect to stimulus funding as, quote, simply absurd, unquote. Separate from the absence of such protections, what options are available to you as head of the RET board to assist in protecting federal whistleblowers?
Sir, I've been pretty aggressive about protecting whistleblowers in my former position as Inspector General Interior. I don't intend to abandon that practice now. When the board hears from a whistleblower, we're going to make sure that the appropriate IG gets the information, and if there's any charge of retaliation, I'm going to be pretty aggressive about making sure that we try to put a stop to that.
Thank you very much. I trust that you will and look forward to you doing so. Mr. Chairman, I'm out of my time.
An even better example for all of us, Ms. Dow Kemper is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I thank you both for coming today and speaking in front of us. As a new member of Congress and someone who did vote for the Recovery Act, obviously I feel a lot of obligation to make sure that this money is spent in the way those of us who voted for it intended. So, Mr. Devaney, with that in mind, looking to the future, when you closed down your office in 2013, what would you consider a success? Could you describe that to me, please?
Well, that we've held fraud, waste, or mismanagement to an absolute minimum. That we've been able to prevent that from happening as opposed to merely detecting it after it happened. With respect to the website, my hope is that this website will serve as a prototype for how we provide transparency to the American people for years to come. I think if we do this right, we take our time, do it right, and that transparency becomes part of what we do every day, that folks in the future will look to this website as a model for how to build future models, to democratize the process. I mean, this is the very first time that I can recall that every dollar is being tagged by a specific title of recovery funds. And for an IG, that's very exciting because I get a better shot at making sure that none of it is wasted or fraud takes place.
I've asked my staff, particularly back in my district, to try to track what they can within my district. Can you give me any suggestions on what I should be trying to do back in my district? You know, trying to make the transparency and the accountability there for the people in the 3rd District of Pennsylvania.
Well, I'm hoping to give everybody in the 3rd District of Pennsylvania an opportunity in the not-too-distant future to be able, for instance, to go on that website and put in a zip code and see the expenditures in their neighborhood, or look at across the country. Can't do that now, but I'm very confident that in the coming months, in the short amount of months, we're going to be able to do that for you.
Summertime, fall, end of the year, when do you have any thoughts on?
I stay awake a little bit at night worrying about October 10th, which is when when the data comes rushing into the government from the recipients. And so by then, it has to work.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Dodaro, GAO has also been conducting extensive work on the government's acquisition resources. What improvements need to be made to enhance an agency's ability to intervene and prevent misuse of funds at a time when speedily completing a grant or contract action is also being emphasized?
Yeah, the acquisition area is one, as you mentioned, that we have tracked. A number of federal contracting activities on our high-risk list that we keep. In the acquisition workforce area in particular is important that there be adequate numbers of people that are there in order to track some of the contracting activities. This has been a particular area we focused on at the Department of Defense, where they've doubled the amount of spending on contract services for over the past several years, but the acquisition workforce has grown less than 1%. So having the adequate numbers of people are important. People have to be trained properly. There has to be adequate reporting and monitoring of those activities. Now, there's also important that the proper contracting vehicles be used, that there be competition and contracting whenever possible to ensure that the government has the best prices available for the services that they're trying to contract with. So those are some of the fundamental things that we think. In this area, I know for the Recovery Act that the Inspectors General have been focused on trying to provide some best practices, as we have up front, to try to deal with the contracting activities and following these best practices to minimize potential problems going forward. But it's an area to keep an eye on as the Recovery Act money gets distributed over the next few years.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. We do have votes coming up shortly, but I'll recognize myself for a second round of questioning, and we should have time for all three of us to ask the second round, and the second panel will probably be after a series of votes. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Devaney, it may be true that not all of the accountability and transparency we would like to achieve with the Recovery Act is achievable right now, but the first step in achieving a government that is accountable and transparent is to elect people to office who want to be transparent and accountable, and to see those obstacles not as an excuse for being opaque and unaccountable, but as something to try to overcome and continue to try to overcome. And our experience in trying to provide as much transparency and accountability as possible now will improve our efforts later. It'll be a continuing effort to get more and more accountable, more and more transparent. Mr. Dodaro, in your testimony, you say the Department of Energy, I believe that Mr. Whitaker has a couple of graphics that are, I think it's being displayed here for you. Your testimony, you say the Department of Energy has obligated, I assume contracted, $342 million of the funds allocated for the Office of Science. In the appendix to your testimony, you provide a great deal of detail on the spending, but at the DOE Recovery Act website, it's very easy to find the 342 number in the total obligations, but high nigh impossible to find the level of detail that you have provided in the appendix. How did the GAO get the level of detail that you reported? Did I say, Mr.
Yes.
Dodaro? Yes.
Right, right. Yeah, our staff interviewed the people at the Department of Energy and looked at the supporting documentation available. Obviously we have more access to information than the general public would be, but that doesn't mean that the websites could not be improved and additional level of detail there, and I think that's the expectation going forward. But we did it through normal auditing procedures that we have.
What is the task of getting that level of detail that is in the appendix to your testimony available to all God's children with internet access, right, which is most of God's children in this country at least now, up in a usable form?
Yeah, I think that the task is to just put in the disciplined processes necessary in order to achieve that. And as I mentioned earlier in response to Congressman Brown's question, I mean, this is a stretch goal for agencies to have that level of detailed, timely reporting. It could be achieved, but there needs to be disciplined processes put in place to make sure that when it is posted. It's complete, accurate, and timely, and I think that's the expectation of the administration moving forward, is to try to get that level of detail provided. Now, that money has been obligated, and as things move through the process, additional funds will be become obligated. But I think that it's just a matter of having the proper procedures in place.
Okay. Mr. Devaney, our committee is looking into contracting issues at one of the agencies within our subcommittee's jurisdiction, or our committee's jurisdiction, and our initial efforts suggest that the staff, the contracting staff, are not particularly aware of the legal requirements of the Recovery Act. And that is worrisome, that if they don't know about it, they're not going to do it very well. What efforts are either of you making to try to make sure that all those in government agencies know what the requirements are?
We have our compliance, procurement compliance staff out there talking to the chief procurement officers of each of the agencies. I'm not sure what agency you're referring to, but there's the visit. There's the opportunity I had to speak to the cabinet on a couple of occasions in talking about, the work that we were seeing initially was sloppy, that mistakes were being made. It's probably true that this goes on all the time, but the sunlight has never been shown on this work before. So I know the Vice President, for instance, challenged the secretaries to make sure that those kinds of guidance pieces that are coming out of OMB get down to the lowest level, which is not always the case in most big departments. And every time we have an opportunity to interact with those levels, we're trying to be helpful and informative to them as to what the rules really are.
Mr. Dodaro?
I would just say in response to your question about our activities here, our responsibilities under the Recovery Act are mostly to track the uses of the funds at the state and local level. So we've been deferring to the inspectors general to work with the federal departments and agencies. Now, what we will plan to do is coordinate with them. If we see some gaps or other areas that we can help out in, we will do that as part of our coordination and follow-up activities.
Okay, my time has expired. Dr. Brown for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Just going along with what the Chairman was just asking, state and local governments and even the private sector are being overwhelmed with both funding and new transparency requirements. Does the Act allow states to use stimulus money to increase their ability to comply with transparency and accountability requirements? And do you have any recommendations of how the federal government can assist state and locals in meeting these requirements for both of you, please?
I would say, in our first report, Congressman, last month, we recommended that OMB clarify this very point. Now, some of these programs are existing programs that allow for administrative expenses to be recouped, a certain percentage of them. There's indirect cost rate allocations that are in some of the programs, but there's a lot of confusion out there at the state and local level, and we recommended that OMB clarify this, and I think they have a number of options available to them in order to do this. Our understanding is they're looking at this very carefully and hope to clarify it soon. I think this is a very important issue because I do believe that a number of states have very legitimate concerns about their ability to implement adequate accountability, and this clarification is very important.
Mr. Devaney.
Same thing. I think OMB is about to clarify that issue and maybe bring a little help to the states. I hear this every time I talk to them, and when asked if I would be supportive of even legislation that might help in this area, I've personally responded yes. So they need help. They're overwhelmed with this responsibility. As you know, the federal IG's got a considerable amount of money to perform oversight, and the states didn't get anything. So I'm empathetic to that situation. I want to help them to the best. I will do anything to help them and be very supportive of any effort to make sure that money gets down to them.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I understand there is some legislation that's going to help mitigate this issue, but I think this act has tremendous unfunded mandates all the way down even to the local contractor that people just don't understand. In fact, a lot of states have looked at opting out of various parts of this act for that reason. Mr. Devaney, you noted in your testimony that you held an online dialogue to receive comments on how best to structure the recovery.gov website and how to best collect and analyze data. What, if any, notable consensus or theme emerged from this dialogue?
Well, I'm still waiting for the official results from NAPA, which was our partner in this. But my understanding is there's a number of really good, solid ideas that emerged from this exercise. Some very notable people wrote to us and suggested things. As part of the process, people were able to engage in a running dialogue and vote, and actually vote at the end of the day. So I haven't seen the tallies of the votes, but you know, we had been looking already, of course, at what's out there. But the people that I have doing that told me they were surprised by some of the ideas. We've got to consider them, but we've got to do it very quickly.
When do you expect to announce on how you plan to incorporate any suggestions as a result of that dialogue?
Well, I think we're going to move very quickly to, the dialogue is being shaped by NAPA to reflect the buckets of information we got. We're going to take a look at that, then we're going to move very quickly to having some people in to show us things as opposed to just talking about them, and do that in a competitive way in a very short period of time.
All right, very good. Do you expect that the information detailed on recovery.gov will be maintained and updated throughout the life of the stimulus awards and grants?
Yes, absolutely.
Do you believe that it would be appropriate, as Dr. Elig has suggested, to include information on performance outcomes on the recovery.gov website?
I think the whole issue of performance metrics is an issue that we haven't really addressed yet, and as you may know, there's an advisory panel that is supposed to be appointed by the President to provide the board with expert advice. I'm very much interested in having some performance people or a performance person on that panel, and have made that known. I want to very quickly get my hands around that as soon as I can find the time to get. Once the vendors are selected and that's being built, then I want to go back to the metrics and try to see what we can do in that area.
I think it's very critical to have those performance metrics in place, and I thank you, sir. My time is up.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Ms. Dalkemper for 5 minutes.
Mr. Devaney, during the drafting of the Recovery Act, there was concern among the Inspectors General that the board had been given too much power to determine what investigations they would be allowed to pursue, or that there was insufficient protection against political interference with investigations. And ultimately, the language in the Act made it clear that the Inspectors General retain their independent discretion. I just want to ask if you're comfortable with the Act's language limiting the board's authority in this area.
Well, if I had written it, I may have written it differently. I certainly am not about to tell an Inspector General that they should not investigate something. I don't think I would ever do that. I think I'm expressing the view of the board entirely, and I've made it known in any opportunity I've had before the IGs to tell them that. I'm going to speak to them next week down at their annual retreat. I will reiterate that. The board is not about to tell somebody not to investigate something. So that language, it's implied in the language that the board would do that. We're not going to do that.
Okay, that's good to hear. That's all I have. I don't have any further questions.
I don't have any further questions either. We've not yet been called to votes. I suppose it makes sense to excuse this panel. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
And we will continue to talk with you about how to do this. And perhaps we should begin the second panel, although we will probably not be able to complete all the testimony of the panel before we're called to votes. And we'll all just be at ease for a second while everyone gets repositioned.